Hello guys, I trust you're doing great today. So today we're going to be talking on why Rwanda is closing down churches. I know there is so much in the internet right now about Rwanda closing down churches. So I want to bring you this news and I want to explain to you why Rwanda is closing down churches, what the government is actually saying about the closing down of churches. So in July, Rwanda closed down about 7,700 churches according to the chief executive of Rwandan Governance Board. It says Rwanda closed down 7,700 churches. And she said, as a chief executive, she said uh, most of the churches that were affected, most of the house of worship that were affected, did not have the requisite permit to operate, and the others could not even the qualification of the leaders or some of others of the churches, they were not even qualified to operate houses of worship. So there are two things that are involved here. The first is they did not have the requirements to operate. Some of the churches did not have the requirements to operate as a religious house. And then second, the leaders did not have the qualification. Even if they had the requirement, some of them, their leaders were not qualified to actually run houses of worship. There is a lot of controversy, a lot of mixed feelings about this, why Rwanda is closing down churches. In 2018, Rwanda closed down 700 churches because they did not meet a specific requirement. There was a law that was passed in that 2018 that stipulated the requirements which houses of worship were supposed to have for them to operate, and all the people, Rwandans, were informed about that. It's been 5 years. So the government went around and did an inspection of about 13,000 churches, and mind you, about 7,700 were closed. Some of them were discovered to be existing in caves. They were operating in caves, and some by the riverside without any shelter. So in caves, with the risks involved, some leaders decided to gather people in caves. They didn't take into consideration their safety, the safety of the members. And some by the riverside, no shelter where the members could come and sit in an open space environment. So the government says for health reasons, for safety reasons, those were the requirements. And of course, for theological reasons, churches had to be closed down. Now the minister of local government, which is in charge of religion and worship, says that this was not meant to target a particular faith, because of course some mosques were closed. This greatly affected Pentecostal churches, yes, because they are almost everywhere. But the mosques that were closed down were, in fact, some of the mosques were also closed down for this reason. So if they did not fit the requirements, they were going to be closed down too. So mosques were shut down as well as churches, but mostly the Pentecostal churches were affected by this particular thing. Now, we've had a lot of authorities come out to speak about this, and I want to quote you what Reverend Laurent, the Archbishop of the Anglican Church of Rwanda. I want to quote a statement he made concerning this to you. He says, if we are taking the requirements more seriously and taking responsibility, we would have made significant progress in complying with the standards. He says if they had taken this more seriously, they would have made significant progress in complying with the standards that were stipulated by the government. because the government did not just close down those churches, it gave them the time. Listen to what Otsia said, Dr. Kaitesi, who is the director of Rwanda Governance Board. She says there should be an intentional willingness to comply with the law. When we register faith-based organizations, we ask them to provide their structure. The education requirement is primarily targeted at the top personnel in the organizational structure. So before the government of Rwanda wants to register any faith-based organization, they ask you questions. First, the structure. You must have a structure. If you don't have a structure where your worshippers can sit, where they can be comfortable, structures that have restrooms that are very comfortable and are up to standard, you are not going to be registered. And then the most important thing is the educational standard of your leader, of whoever is the head of the church. It's very, very important. Without this, you cannot be registered. So some of those churches that were registered, most of these churches that were closed down, are churches that had been existing before this law came into force in 2018, and they did not comply with the laws. Or some of them are also churches that were created, they went into operation without registering. Because as per the law, every church has to be registered. Every house of worship has to be registered with the government before they can operate as an organization or as a house of worship. So these churches did not comply with those laws. And that is why they had to go down. They had to be closed down. Because if the leaders are not qualified, if the leaders don't have a good education, we see what is happening in Africa today. We see what is happening in different African countries, in Nigeria, in Zimbabwe, in Kenya, name it. Any person can open a church. Anybody can just get up one day and open a church. And you see like what happened in Kenya a few months ago, where a leader told his people to commit suicide or something like that, because the war is going to come to an end. And this is what Rwanda is trying to prevent. This is what the government has been working on to prevent. So the church, let me give you some of the requirements. I've said some, but let me give you some. The church must have, the leader must be educated, must be theologically sound. The church must be soundproofed, so that the noise that is made in the church does not affect others. Freedom of religion doesn't mean you should disturb other people who don't want to be part of it. So the church has to be soundproofed. It must have the structure. It must be up to standard where humans can be there. So it must have, as a matter of fact, a restroom where people can actually go there in case they are pressed. It must have a parking. The leader must be educated. Those are just some of the qualifications, some of the requirements for a church to operate in Rwanda. If the church doesn't have a parking, it's going to act as a nuisance to people who are not part of the church. Just imagine that, okay, people have to park their cars and block the road because they have a service. Other people who are going for their own businesses will not be able to go for their businesses because of traffic, because someone has parked his car by the road and has partly blocked the road or completely blocked the road. So the government says that the church needs to have a parking. So you need to have a very comfortable place, and you need to be educated before you can actually operate a church in Rwanda. So the Archbishop of the Anglican Church of Rwanda was very much in line with this decision, and he admitted that the board had asked all faith-based organizations to provide an update of their compliance in September. So if all faith-based organizations don't provide that update by September, by the end of September, we're going to see many more churches shut down. The government of Rwanda have said, if we could create more industries than churches, we are going to solve a bulk of the problems we are facing. The government, the country is going to be better off if more industries are created than churches. We have churches everywhere. But if these churches could be turned to industries, I bet you a lot is going to change, because they are going to provide employment. And the government said they are not a first world country where they can just allow churches to operate like that, where the government can be able to sustain the number of churches that are already there. So the government has to reduce the number of churches, because of course the faith of the people to are very important, and the people have to be encouraged to work and not to pray. This is not an attack on any particular religion, says the minister of local government. It's just to ensure that the citizens are safe and are healthy, both spiritually and physically. Health-wise, everything should be okay. So this is, well, let's hear from a Pentecostal also, because I know most of the churches that were affected were not Orthodox churches, but were mostly the charismatic churches, the rising churches, Pentecostals and all that, these churches that are new generation churches. So let's hear from Pastor Kabagambe Nziza. This is what he says. He's a pastor of New Life Bible Church. Now he argues that these laws are good, but should be applicable mostly to big cities like Kigali. They shouldn't be applicable to rural areas, because some of these rural areas don't really need those laws. Like, they are not very necessary in those areas. Let me quote from him. I quote him. He says, in Kigali, you have neighboring communities that will be affected by sound coming from the church. But in Kagera, there is a church up in the mountains, so there are no neighboring homes. The congregants don't have cars and even motorbikes, so the issue of parking should not be a requirement. So Pastor Caesar is arguing that the issue of parking and soundproofing of the church should not be a requirement in rural areas, because most churches in rural areas are located up the mountains, where the churches are isolated. There are no neighbors around. And the issue of car park should not also be taken into consideration in that area, because most of the people attend those churches don't have vehicles, they don't have cars, they don't have motorbikes. So they mostly come there on foot. So he says there's no need to require a church in a rural area to have car parks or to have soundproof. So those laws should be applicable mostly in Rwanda. In Kigali, sorry, in the capital city of Kigali. Now, what he actually says, it's correct, it's true. I think he doesn't dispute the fact that pastors the educational background of pastors should be tested, should be taken into consideration. They should ask them those requirements, because I also believe that people take advantage of uneducated people. So if the government doesn't go into those rural areas to inspect those churches and close some of them down, which they normally they are going to close most of them down, because most people operate churches in rural areas don't have the requirement. Churches in rural areas don't have structures. Most churches in rural areas, most Pentecostal churches are not proud of structures. And secondly, their leaders are mostly uneducated. They have no background in theology. Some have no background even in secular education. So the government needs to go to those areas to check, to ensure that they are not misleading the followers, they are not misleading people, they are not playing with the faith of people. And if the government finds out that that's the case, the government has to close down as many more churches. And come September, we're going to see many more churches closed down. Those churches that have not complied with the requirements are going to be taken down. They are going to be shut down.